One announcement, 2 decades of planning. The single most ambitious strategic project in modern Chinese history just collided with a wall that Beijing did not see coming, and the consequences are now propagating through the Politburo Standing Committee in ways that nobody in Zhongnanhai is prepared to admit publicly. The Taiwan timeline that Xi Jinping personally staked his political legacy on has not just slipped, it is fractured. And the fracture is visible to anyone willing to read the operational signals that the Chinese system is now broadcasting through its own behavior. But here is what every China correspondent missed in the past several weeks. The disaster is not a single event. The disaster is the cumulative collapse of four separate assumptions that the Taiwan plan depended on, all four of which failed within roughly the same compressed time frame, and all four of which were considered structurally sound by Chinese planners as recently as 18 months ago. The military assumption, the technological assumption, the economic assumption, the diplomatic assumption, each one carried its own internal logic. Each one was supported by years of investment, and each one has now been demonstrated through events outside Beijing's control to be operationally invalid in the specific configuration the plan required. The man who built his career on this plan is now staring at a strategic position that no Chinese leader has occupied since the early 1990s, and the position offers no good options on any timeline that matters politically. This channel runs on no corporate sponsorships, no government contracts, and no editorial filters dictating which strategic realities reach you in their unfiltered form. The analysis you are about to hear is not happening on cable news because cable news is still describing the Taiwan question through frameworks that the underlying reality has already moved past, and it is not happening on Chinese state media because the truth is politically catastrophic for the leadership to acknowledge. If you want to understand what just collapsed and what comes next, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the math of what failed in Beijing's strategic position is brutal, and the math determines whether the next decade tilts toward consolidation or confrontation across the entire Indo Pacific. Here's what actually happened. Over the past several months, a series of overlapping events converged in a way that Chinese strategic planners will study for decades. A scheduled major military exercise in the Taiwan Strait was quietly downgraded in scope and capability demonstration. Senior officers in the Eastern Theater Command Joint Operations Directorate were reassigned in patterns inconsistent with normal rotation cycles. Major procurement contracts associated with the amphibious assault capability were either delayed or restructured in ways that extended delivery timelines significantly. Trade and technology negotiations with key European partners stalled at exactly the moment Beijing needed them to accelerate. Diplomatic outreach to Pacific Island nations and to Southeast Asian capitals produced results that fell substantially below the trajectory the plan required. And in the financial markets, state linked entities began unwinding positions in supply chains that had been carefully accumulated over years, specifically to support the planned timeline. Individually, any one of these signals could be explained as routine adjustment. Together, in the sequence in which they occurred, they form a pattern that defense analysts familiar with closed political systems recognize immediately. The pattern is the institutional response when a major plan has hit a structural barrier that cannot be overcome through additional resources alone. The system does not announce the failure. The system does not formally reassess. The system simply begins making the adjustments that prepare for a different reality, and the adjustments are visible in the behavior even when no statement acknowledges them. The official narrative from Beijing describes nothing meaningful as having changed. State media continues to publish reunification timelines, anniversary references, and historical inevitability framings on the established schedule. Government spokesmen continue to repeat the standard talking points about the Taiwan question being an internal Chinese matter. Military exercises continue at high tempo with continued threatening rhetoric around the island. On the surface, everything looks exactly as it did 2 years ago. That is the public version. The operational reality contradicts the public version at every significant point. The specific shifts in personnel, procurement, exercise composition, and diplomatic outreach all point in the same direction. They point toward an internal reassessment that has concluded the original plan, in its original form, cannot be executed on the original timeline at acceptable cost. The reassessment has not been announced because announcing it would impose unacceptable political costs on the leadership that committed to the plan. But the reassessment is operating in the form of incremental decisions that, accumulated over months, constitute a fundamental shift in the strategic posture, even though no individual decision is large enough to require formal acknowledgement. Now, here is the part that defense analysts in Washington, Tokyo, and Canberra have been quietly converging on, but have not yet stated publicly with full clarity. The Chinese strategic position regarding Taiwan has undergone a structural deterioration over the past 3 years that is now visible in operational signals, and the deterioration is not the result of any single American or Allied action. It is the result of multiple parallel adjustments by multiple regional actors that, taken together, have closed strategic windows the Chinese plan depended on. The plan was not defeated by an opponent. The plan was rendered obsolete by an environment that refused to cooperate with its underlying assumptions. Let me show you what those four failed assumptions actually were and why their simultaneous collapse represents the kind of strategic disaster that the Chinese system is not institutionally prepared to absorb. The first assumption was that the regional military balance would continue to favor the construction of a credible cross-strait operational capability. This assumption was reasonable in 2018. It was tenuous by 2022. It is now demonstrably invalid in the specific form the plan required. Japan has crossed the 2% of GDP defense spending threshold for the first time since 1945, with explicit commitments to long-range strike capability that places Chinese coastal cities within retaliatory reach. South Korea has deepened defense integration with both the United States and Japan in ways that produce a coherent Northeast Asian deterrent architecture that did not exist 3 years ago. The Philippines has reopened expanded basing access to American forces at sites that put pre-positioned hardware within direct support range of any Taiwan contingency. Australia has signed nuclear submarine cooperation agreements that, when delivered, give the Indo-Pacific theater submarine strike capability against any coastal Chinese target. None of these developments existed in their current form in 2020. All of them are now operationally meaningful in ways that compound the difficulty of any plan that assumed regional passivity. The second assumption was that Chinese technological self-sufficiency would reach the threshold required for sustained confrontation within the operational window the plan required. This assumption depended on continued access to Western and Japanese semiconductor manufacturing equipment during the bridge period between current Chinese capabilities and projected domestic production at advanced nodes. The technology embargo coordinated between Washington, Tokyo, Seoul, The Hague, and Berlin has substantially closed that bridge period. Chinese domestic production at the most advanced nodes remains years behind the original timeline. The replacement equipment required to operate independently of Western supply chains either cannot be manufactured domestically at the required quality or cannot be manufactured at all without access to specific inputs that are now restricted. The technology window the plan needed has narrowed in ways that capital investment alone cannot reverse, and the narrowing is accelerating as additional restrictions are imposed. Stay with this part because it is critical. The two failed assumptions described so far would each have been recoverable through extended planning. Combined with the next two, they constitute a structural barrier that the plan cannot overcome within any politically meaningful timeline. The third assumption was that the global economic leverage Beijing had accumulated through trade integration, infrastructure investment, and supply chain dominance would prove sufficient to deter the coordinated Western response that any Taiwan contingency would otherwise trigger. This assumption rested on the calculation that Western economies were sufficiently dependent on Chinese manufacturing, Chinese rare earth processing, Chinese pharmaceutical inputs, and Chinese capital flows that a coherent sanctions regime would be politically impossible to assemble. The assumption was reasonable in 2019. It is now visibly weakening. Western economies have begun the slow but consistent process of supply chain diversification that, while incomplete and expensive, has substantially reduced the deterrent value of Chinese economic leverage. The leverage still exists. The leverage no longer prevents the coordinated response that the plan required Beijing to make politically impossible. The economic deterrent has not disappeared. It has degraded to the point where it can no longer be relied upon to perform the specific function the plan assigned to it. The fourth assumption was the diplomatic isolation of Taipei. This assumption was the single longest running element of Chinese strategy on the Taiwan question, executed consistently across decades through pressure on third countries to terminate official recognition of Taiwan and accept the One China principle in increasingly comprehensive forms. The campaign was, by historical standards, remarkably successful. The number of countries maintaining formal diplomatic relations with Taipei has fallen to a handful. The pressure mechanisms have been refined to extraordinary precision. And yet, in the past 5 years, the substantive diplomatic relationships Taiwan maintains with major democracies have deepened in ways that compensate substantially for the absence of formal recognition. Parliamentary delegations, ministerial visits, defense cooperation agreements, intelligence sharing arrangements, and trade frameworks have proliferated to the point where Taiwan is, in practical terms, more diplomatically integrated with the major Western democracies than at any time since 1979. The formal isolation that Beijing engineered has been hollowed out by substantive integration that the Chinese pressure system cannot effectively counter. Now look at the math, and the math is brutal in ways that reveal the full structural failure of the plan. The cumulative Chinese investment in the components of the Taiwan plan, factoring in military modernization, technological development, infrastructure construction, diplomatic operations, and economic positioning, exceeds $3 trillion over 2 decades. The combined cost to the United States, Japan, Australia, South Korea, the Philippines, India, and the European Union of closing the strategic windows the plan depended on, measured through marginal new defense commitments, technology restrictions, supply chain adjustments, and diplomatic coordination, is less than $500 billion in the same period. That is a 6-to-1 cost ratio in favor of the deniers of the plan against the architect of the plan. Read that again slowly. $3 trillion of preparation has been substantially neutralized by $500 billion of response. The defender of the status quo has outbid the revisionist by an order of magnitude on a price the revisionist cannot adjust upward without admitting the original investment was strategically miscalculated. The Chinese demographic math compounds the strategic math in ways that no amount of additional resources can reverse. The working age population has peaked and is now declining at rates that accelerate through the 2030s. The military window that the plan optimized for assumed a sufficient demographic base to support extended industrial mobilization. That base is shrinking faster than the planners modeled. The social welfare obligations to an aging population are consuming a fraction of state capacity that the original plan did not budget for. The demographic curve is the one variable that no policy decision can reverse, and it is moving against the plan in ways that subtract operational years from every realistic timeline. The Chinese economic position has weakened in ways that compound the demographic constraint. The property sector crisis has consumed financial resources that would otherwise have supported continued military modernization. Local government debt overhangs have constrained the fiscal flexibility that any sustained strategic posture requires. The youth unemployment problem has produced social pressures that the system must address with resources that cannot then be applied to external strategic objectives. None of these problems is fatal individually. All of them together describe a domestic resource environment that no longer supports the original plan's funding requirements without accepting trade-offs that the leadership has been unwilling to make publicly. Pull back from the immediate question and look at the strategic chessboard. The collapse of the Taiwan plan is not occurring in isolation. It is occurring within a global strategic environment where every major actor is making its own calculations about what the failure means for them. The United States is watching with calculations that the standard policy framework does not fully capture. The window for coordinated Allied response that the plan depended on Beijing closing has not closed, and Washington's planners are now examining whether the strategic position has improved sufficiently to support more assertive American posture on the Taiwan question. The answer is being debated in classified rooms with conclusions that have not yet been announced. The implications for American defense procurement, force posture, and alliance management are substantial, and they are being worked through in real time by planning organizations across the executive branch. Japan is watching with the particular attention of a country that has the most to gain from a degraded Chinese position. The Japanese strategic community has been signaling through speeches, defense planning documents, and procurement decisions that Tokyo intends to capitalize on the current window to consolidate strategic positioning that was politically impossible during the post-war era. The implications for the Japanese constitutional debate, for the structure of the Japan-United States alliance, and for the broader Northeast Asian security architecture are being worked through in ways that will reshape regional dynamics for the next several decades. Russia is watching with concerns that align differently. The Russian strategic position has depended on Chinese strength serving as a counterweight to Western power in the broader Eurasian theater. A degraded Chinese position regarding Taiwan reduces the strategic value of the Russian-Chinese partnership in ways that affect Moscow's bargaining position on multiple other questions. Russian planners are now considering whether the partnership remains the central element of Russian strategy or whether selective accommodation with the West on specific issues offers better returns. The conclusions are not yet visible. The deliberations are ongoing. North Korea is watching with the practical interest of an actor whose entire strategic posture depends on Chinese strategic depth. A weakened Chinese position regarding Taiwan reduces the credibility of Chinese security guarantees to Pyongyang, which forces North Korean planners to consider alternative arrangements that did not previously appear necessary. The implications for North Korean nuclear posture, for the willingness to engage in tactical diplomacy with the United States, and for the long term trajectory of the regime are now being reassessed in ways that produce uncertainty about future North Korean behavior. The regional Southeast Asian states are watching with calculations that the Standard Alliance framework does not capture. Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia each face different versions of the same fundamental question. Does the current strategic environment offer an opportunity to consolidate gains through alignment with the apparent winning coalition, or does it produce risks that require continued hedging? The answers vary by country, but the questions are universal across the region. The choices being made now will shape Southeast Asian security alignment for the next generation. Then there is the dimension almost nobody in the Western policy community discusses publicly. The Chinese strategic position regarding Taiwan, however degraded relative to the original plan, remains militarily formidable and politically determined. The disaster is not that China has become weak. The disaster is that China has become strong in ways that do not solve the specific problem the plan was designed to solve, and the gap between the strength that exists and the strength the plan required is the gap that Beijing now has to manage politically without acknowledging that it exists. A revisionist power with capabilities that fall short of its stated objectives is, in some respects, more dangerous than a power whose capabilities clearly match its objectives, because the gap between aspiration and capacity produces pressure for actions that compensate through different mechanisms. The risk is not Chinese weakness. The risk is Chinese frustration combined with capability that remains substantial even after the plan has failed in its original form. The most honest analytical position available right now reads as follows. The Chinese plan for Taiwan as originally constituted is no longer executable on its original timeline with acceptable confidence of success. The Chinese capability to compel Taiwanese reunification through any of the available coercive mechanisms has been reduced, though not eliminated, by the cumulative effect of regional and global responses to the plan's construction. The political constraints on Chinese leadership acknowledging this reality are severe, which means the operational reality and the public narrative will continue to diverge in ways that produce additional strategic complications. The next phase of the Taiwan question will be characterized by Chinese pressure tactics that compensate rhetorically for the underlying capability gap, while the substantive trajectory of cross-strait dynamics moves further from Beijing's preferred outcomes. The window the plan needed has closed. A different window may eventually open, but it will not open on the timeline that the current leadership configuration requires. Here is what to watch for over the next 12 months, and here is when each indicator becomes meaningful. Within the next 90 days, watch for the structure of Chinese military exercise activity in the Taiwan Strait. If exercise tempo continues at current intensity but with reduced amphibious capability demonstration, the operational acknowledgement of the plan's failure has reached the planning bureaucracy, even if it has not reached the public narrative. If exercise composition shifts towards sustained coercion patterns rather than invasion preparation patterns, the strategic posture is being repositioned to deliver pressure without requiring the operational capability that the original plan demanded. The exercises will continue. The character of the exercises will reveal which version of the Chinese posture is actually being prepared. Within the next 6 months, watch for the language used in major Chinese policy addresses, party congresses, and senior leader speeches. The vocabulary will shift in subtle but detectable ways. References to specific timelines will become less precise. Concepts of patient strategic development will receive greater emphasis. Frameworks of long-term inevitability will receive more attention relative to frameworks of urgent action. The shifts will not be acknowledged as shifts. They will be visible to anyone tracking the language with consistency over time, and they will signal the internal recalibration that the leadership cannot announce explicitly. Within the next 12 months, watch for procurement and force structure adjustments in the People's Liberation Army Navy and the People's Liberation Army Air Force. The capabilities required for the specific amphibious assault scenarios the original plan envisioned are different from the capabilities required for sustained coercion or for broader regional projection. The procurement decisions made during this window will reveal which mission set the system is now optimizing for, and the choices will indicate whether the original plan remains the planning baseline or whether a substantially different posture is being constructed. Within the next 18 months, watch for diplomatic outreach from Beijing to capitals that have recently strengthened their positioning toward Taipei. Specifically, watch for whether Chinese diplomacy attempts to roll back the substantive integration that has developed between Taiwan and the major democracies, or whether Chinese diplomacy shifts toward accepting the integration while attempting to constrain its further expansion. The first approach indicates continued commitment to the original plan's diplomatic isolation framework. The second approach indicates a fundamental strategic reassessment that has accepted the degraded position and is now playing for less ambitious outcomes than the original plan envisioned. Here are three predictions with a clock attached. First, within 6 months, you will see at least one major Chinese state media organ publish a piece reframing the Taiwan question through a multi generational framework rather than a near term operational framework. The framing will be subtle. It will appear in a longer piece embedded in broader strategic commentary, easy to miss for casual readers, but it will appear because the political class needs to begin preparing the domestic audience for an extended timeline that the strategic class has already accepted as necessary. Second, within 12 months, you will see significant adjustments in Chinese military exercise patterns that, when analyzed cumulatively, will indicate the operational posture has shifted from invasion preparation toward sustained coercion. The shift will not be announced. It will be visible in the exercise composition, the unit participation patterns, and the equipment configurations involved. Third, within 24 months, the operational consensus in Western intelligence communities will have shifted from a near term Taiwan readiness benchmark to a substantially later benchmark, and this shift will eventually be acknowledged in unclassified threat assessments before being acknowledged by Chinese officials. The dream that broke in Beijing did not break because of any single mistake. It broke because four separate assumptions that the plan required all failed within a compressed time frame, and the simultaneous failures produced a strategic position that no amount of additional investment can fully repair within the political window the current leadership requires. The capabilities Beijing built remain substantial. The strategic objectives Beijing committed to remain unchanged. The gap between the two has opened to the point where the original plan no longer offers a credible path to the stated objectives, and that gap is now the central operational problem that the Chinese system has to manage without acknowledging that it exists. What ends here is not the Chinese state. China remains a continental power with enormous economic weight, deep technological base, substantial military capability, and demonstrated political coherence. What ends here is the specific plan on the specific timeline with the specific assumptions that the current leadership committed itself to delivering. The ambitions will persist. The capabilities will continue to develop. The strategic competition will continue, possibly intensifying as Beijing seeks alternative paths to objectives that the original plan can no longer reach. But the specific dream of decisive reunification within the personally meaningful political horizon of the current leadership configuration is no longer a credible operational plan, and the recognition of that fact is now propagating through the Chinese system in ways that will reshape the strategic environment for years. So here is the question this video leaves you with. Which signal arrives first? The narrative reframing in state media that acknowledges the extended timeline, the exercise pattern shift that confirms the operational repositioning, or the procurement adjustment that reveals the force structure recalibration. Drop your prediction in the comments. Narrative, exercise, or procurement. Tell me which one happens first and why, because the comments on this channel consistently surface analysis that outperforms what reaches professional commentary, and every prediction in those comments goes directly into the analysis for what comes next. If this gave you a framework that mainstream coverage has not assembled, a way of seeing the Chinese strategic position as a complex of interrelated assumptions rather than as a single monolithic threat, share this video with one person who needs to understand that the Taiwan conversation has already shifted even if the official talking points have not. The strategic reality moves first. The official acknowledgement follows. The headlines come last. You are now ahead of all three. The next video goes somewhere this one did not reach. It examines what a degraded Chinese position regarding Taiwan means for every adjacent strategic question, the Russian calculation about partnership value, the North Korean reassessment of patronage credibility, the Iranian alliance dynamics, the implications for the broader non Western coalition that Beijing has been positioning itself to anchor. The implications fan outward in ways that are only beginning to be visible, and they reshape every secondary strategic question on the global chessboard. Subscribe so you are there when it lands, because the second order effects of this strategic shift will be the actual content of the next several years of global politics, and the people who see them first will navigate them more successfully than the people who learn about them from the newspaper. The disaster that just unfolded in Beijing will be the subject of strategic studies for the next 50 years. You are watching the disaster get analyzed in real time, before the textbooks are written, before the consensus forms, before the official story decides what it will say. Stay with this channel and you will keep seeing the picture clearly while everyone else is still describing a China that no longer fully exists.